There are different types of research questions. One way is depending on the type of gap you have, your research question can be phrased differently. If you are purely focusing on an empirical gap, normally you go after a what question. If you are focusing on a solution gap or normally methodological gap, your question is normally a how question. And if you are after a theoretical question, it very often, not always, is a sort of why/how question. Remember, the word how is slightly, I mean, in the language, how means different things. And sometimes your supervisor suggests that, can you formulate your research question using how? I think there they mostly mean, think about the mechanisms, things about the causal relations, things about the reasons behind something is happening, which means the same why question as we discussed here. The other how is the how, which is about the finding a solution. How can we fix this? How can we improve that? How can we remove these biases? So mind the way that you actually write the words of questions, but then see what is the meaning behind that. The questions can be open, exploratory, inductive, sometimes called phenomenon driven, or it can be narrow, focused, deductive, theory testing way. This is something that will actually be related also to your research approach. Is qualitative or quantitative? It very much reflects your own interest, your way of thinking, the way of thinking of your supervisor. Do you want to ask about, for instance, the range of mechanisms that enable organizations to have an alignment? Or you want to test the effect of one particular alignment mechanism on the certain outcomes, which is then more deductive question. It depends on the state of the literature that you work on it, whether you choose the type of gap or the more open or, let's say, closed type of question. Normally, when you work within a very established literature, a lot of concepts, a lot of ideas, a lot of propositions are already developed. You may go after more deductive theory testing questions. You may. Therefore, you go with more narrow questions, deductive questions. The field that you may be now studying might be new, but new, not empirically new, theoretically new. And therefore, you want to actually have more open, exploratory, empirical type of empirically driven questions. At Keen, we normally tend to favor more open questions that are very narrow, but very much depends on your supervisor and the topic. It depends on the type of gap that you have. Is it an open gap? Is it just basically a very specific one? The aim of inquiry is, let's say, testing an existing theory, checking something that people already studied in a different context, in a new context, or coming up with a whole new understanding of a very novel phenomenon. What is actually mostly appropriate for your thinking? Some of us are very much, in favor of open thinking, divergent thinking. We call them, these people, D, type D. Some of us are more kind of A or B type. I mean, that's the mental theory of whole brain theory. We favor more concrete, specific, sharp type of question. See what works best with your own thinking, and then go with that type of question. And of course, feasibility. No more comments on this. It's already obvious because of the situations and getting access to the data. So another example. Again, I think this is another interesting example. We can learn from it. Let's just first read it and see how we can discuss this and improve. I put this here because it's a very natural process of articulating and developing a research question. So let's look at the second one. How can platform owners strategically manage and incentivize these complementors? And what are the complementors' motivations, right? So these two, most likely when you were thinking, were not actually two different research. They were not two different research questions. You had a very clear, or maybe less clear idea about that they are the two sides of the same coin, which I fully agree. So if you discover the motivations of the complementors to join such a platform, then which is the answer to the second part of your question, then you can go and answer the first part of your question, which is how the owners of the platform can play with those incentives to bring those complementors to the platform, right? So in that sense, I think you have one question, but then there is a practical version of it, which is at the beginning of the sentence, how managers can strategically do something, which is based on a more, let's say, theoretical or scientific question, which is what are the incentives of the complementors for joining such platform? So in that sense, you can easily drop the first question because that would be definitely a practical question that you will be able to answer once you know the answer to your research question. So remember, when we have a research question, in order to empirically investigate that research question, we formulate one or a few empirical questions. And once we answer that research question, we normally can answer some practical questions related to that. But we don't need to put the empirical questions and the practical questions within the research question. Actually, it's better to wipe them out because the empirical questions are useful for chapter 3. When you want to describe your method and say how I'm going to empirically investigate my question. And practical questions are useful for the introduction and the discussion at the end. Because then you can actually say, so what is the implications for the managers? Now I can say, managers, these are the important incentives. If you can play with them, you can sort of bring these complementors to the domain.